Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to join you today on this important occasion. As Cynthia mentioned, I'm a retired Army colonel with almost 30 years active service. But 3 of those years I spent here, first as the Army Chief of Staff Chair, then as the Chairman of the Department of Military Strategy and Operations. I consider those 3 years amongst my most proud and meaningful. Just as in previous presentations, these are the topics I'll be discussing with you. These came from guidelines that we received from Cynthia. My tour of duty in the war was from April of 1969 to March of 1970. When I arrived in Vietnam, I was a first lieutenant of infantry assigned to the 101st Airborne Division. During my tour, I spent 3 months as an infantry platoon leader, 6 months as a company commander, and 3 months as a staff officer at division headquarters. Looking back, there were 3 notable things about my tour of duty, and those 3 were the nature of and the variety of the missions that I faced in each. For example, in my first 4 months, my duties entailed working with local South Vietnamese National Guard forces and training them in pacification duties. Most notable about that is that I got to see the weaknesses in the pacification mission, most notably how the South Vietnamese government did not provide the political leadership that may have rallied the populace to their side, and the lack of security provided to the people from the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. During the next 5 months, I led my infantry company on often futile searches for the elusive main force enemy units. And whenever we managed to make contact, we were often outnumbered. Only massive firepower enabled us to engage successfully in battle. Especially frustrating was that when we engaged near the borders, the enemy was able to break contact and escape across them. My last 3 months as a staff officer, I had the opportunity to participate and observe senior Army officers in their direction of tactical operations against the enemy. In particular, division corps and even theater commanders showed and voiced tremendous frustration in their directions or lack thereof from Washington. Particularly annoying was when they were ordered to cease major offensive operations and turn them over to the South Vietnamese during the Vietnamization program under Nixon. When I returned home to anything but a supportive welcome from the American people, my experiences in the war piqued my curiosity in how the U.S. leaders in Washington, both civilian and military, had devised what we were supposed to do in Vietnam and why. My now piqued interest in the why and how of our involvement in South Vietnam was exasperated by the seemingly senseless loss of lives and the carnage inflicted on others. Now, that interest had become not only intense, but emotional and personal. I had lost a score of soldiers killed in action and severely wounded in my commands. My West Point class of 1967 had lost 29 killed in action, many of whom had been close personal friends, teammates, and roommates while I was at the academy. These men were not strangers, they were brothers, and they were family. At first, I did not have much of an opportunity to seek any answers. I was first assigned to train Rangers and then young infantry officer candidates to go over there during the waning years of our combat involvement. In 1975, the Department of Army alerted me to an assignment at West Point to teach history. I applied to graduate school at the University of North Carolina and was accepted and arrived in the beginning of 1975. No sooner had I arrived when I was greeted one morning with the headlines shown on this slide. My world was falling apart when I learned of the fall of South Vietnam and the end of the war I had fought in and so many comrades had died. I remember immediately wondering, how could this have happened? Soon after, I met with my faculty advisor and began to set up my academic program for a master's degree. I asked my advisor if there were courses that I could take either as part of the program or in addition that may enable me to find some answers to my questions of what happened and why in Vietnam. Though there were few, there were some, and I took as many as possible. Of course, my main task was to complete my degree and to return to West Point to teach. From that point on, I made it a point to start research on the whys and hows of the war in addition to my normal graduate studies in preparation for teaching. In the course of my research, I delved into recently published Pentagon papers. These, of course, were the documents that had resulted from Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara's directed study of policy making during the war, which a disgruntled Defense Department worker by the name of Daniel Ellsberg had released to the New York Times. The New York Times papers were quite limited, but a senator by the name of Gravel had some more extensive documents placed in a 4-volume set, which became known as the Gravel edition of the Pentagon Papers, depicted on the left-hand side of this slide. These are the ones that I had an intense interest in. As I read through the various documents, I came across one particularly extraordinary memorandum. It's shown on the right-hand side of this slide. It was written by one of McNamara's assistants, a man named John McNaughton. The memo shared his views with his boss on why they thought the U.S. should be fighting in Vietnam. What was and still is startling is that while the public and official proclamations were that we were there to defend against communist aggression and keep the South Vietnamese people from tyranny, these were not the major aims that the major defense leaders who were running the war had set for their sending thousands and hundreds of thousands of American youth into battle. Rather, it was, as shown, U.S. prestige that was the number one reason Americans would be dying or were dying or had died for. Upon reading this memo, I was taken aback at the seeming academic demeanor of these leaders. I remember recalling the phrase, "Hail Caesar, we who are about to die, salute you." Yet it was this set of documents that would propel me for the rest of my career and afterwards to find answers to my questions. Ultimately, unknown to me at the time, the quest would result in a War College course on the war and 2 books. When I reported to West Point, the department head assigned me to teach one of my favorite courses when I was a cadet, the history of military art. I loved teaching that course at West Point. Despite the challenges of the teaching assignment, I had time to continue my research on the war. Most of my reading entailed Bernard Fall's early books on Indochina, some of the early monographs coming out of the U.S. Army Center for Military History on the Vietnam Studies, articles in some early books by newsmen, and early memoirs by participants such as Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, General Westmoreland, and Admiral Sharp. And of course, the continuation of the Pentagon Papers. Nevertheless, it was a continuation of my research. As I look back at the relevance of my wartime service to my career and life, there was one assignment, ironically, that became most relevant to my understanding of the Washington decision-making during the Vietnam War. That assignment was my tour of duty in the Pentagon on the Army staff from 1982 to 1985. Why was that so? Because the basic management and process system still in use was McNamara's system of analysis, still referred to as the Planning, Programming, and Budgeting System, or PPBS. Moreover, that system still entailed some of McNamara's tools and products, such as the 5-year defense plan, decision memorandums, etc. Most relative to my experiences was the primary focus on the use of effective cost modeling to reach decisions, not only on force levels, but force deployments and use. The relevance was that I could now understand the senior military officer frustrations, such as depicted in Westmoreland's memoirs, on McNamara's strict insistence on using cost analysis and systems effectiveness to justify all requests for troop deployments and use, as well as his use of body counts as a major measure of success in his approach to winning the war. Indeed, as my later research would reveal, though the Joint Staff produced detailed national military strategy in July of 1965, whose objective was to attack and sever the North's major center of gravity, that is, its major reinforcement supply line to the south, that concept was never considered by McNamara nor referred to President Johnson because it was too costly and would require mobilization, something LBJ was not willing to do. Moreover, by 1967, Westmoreland had realized that a search and destroy concept was not working, and he had proposed a similar strategy aimed at severing the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. It too was rejected for those very same reasons by McNamara. The years passed quickly following that first tour in the Pentagon with a command battalion command assignment and another assignment in the Pentagon on the Joint Staff. As I mentioned in the beginning, my last assignment was here at National War College. What I did not mention is that while I developed an elective on the Vietnam War, that was quite an experience because it enabled me to share and discuss all my thoughts and research up to that point with the students who volunteered to take the course. I've been most pleased that the leadership of the college has decided to keep that course, as modified, of course, as part of the elective curriculum, and that it was been taught by some very experienced war veterans, one of whom is here today, Claude Clotfelder. I just have several more slides to address very quickly before I conclude with some last observations on the war that are pertinent to today's presentation and commemoration. After I retired, this slide depicts a project that I worked on in the Department of History at West Point. Because I had taught there, they had decided to stand up an oral history department, and they asked me to take part in its first project, an oral history of my West Point class of 1967. The decision to focus on my class was because we had lost 29 KIAs in Vietnam, the largest of any class. Moreover, the class had had a large number of Valor Awards, 362, to include 3 Distinguished Service Crosses, 79 Silver Stars, and 159 Purple Hearts. The initial result for that department was a film produced and shown on public television called Into Harm's Way. The work that I contributed for that project I later self-published as a book called None Will Surpass: A Story of the 4-Decade Service and Sacrifice of the West Point Class of 1967. Several years later, I finally decided to put together the results and conclusions of my lifelong research on the Vietnam War. Using the latest resources, particularly those that are now emerging from the North Vietnamese archives, I further published a book called Warriors and Fools: How America's Leaders Lost the Vietnam War and Why It Still Matters. Okay, now that I've plugged my books, sorry, Cynthia, let's turn to some observations about what went wrong from a U.S. perspective during the war that may have had an impact on the outcome. This slide addresses the first of 2 major problems or issues that our leaders during the war either got wrong or should have addressed, in my view. This first one addresses Sun Tzu's major premise in war, know your enemy, also addressed by Clausewitz in the quote on the slide. In fact, one of the most critical issues during the war was not knowing our enemy and making false judgments about their intent and capabilities. Throughout the war, we thought the major decision makers in the North were Ho Chi Minh and Giap. In so believing, we thought or made two major assumptions. First, because Ho had shown at the end of the French Indochina War that he was reasonable and open to negotiating a settlement, he would do the same with us. Second, because the majority of during that war, Giap was a proponent of guerrilla insurgency and operations. The war we would face would be the same, that is, an insurgency with guerrilla operations. However, in 2012, a Vietnamese American by the name of Lien Hang Nguyen published a landmark book shown on this slide. Her book is based on first-time access to the Vietnamese archives and Politburo papers during the war. What the book reveals is that Ho Chi Minh and Giap were not the key decision makers, but a man by the name of Le Duan, shown on the far left in the picture along with his two key subordinates, Le Duc Tho and General Nguyen Chi Thanh. What is significant about that is that Le Duan was entirely different in background, personality, and attitude than Ho or Giap. Above everything, he was a hardliner communist who believed the only method of achieving their aim of unification was through the use of force. To him, the demonstration of restraint was a demonstration of weakness. To him, negotiation was only a way to delay and gain time to be able to concentrate the necessary force to conquer the South. Indeed, he had blamed Ho for selling out at the Geneva Convention in 1954, arguing that Ho had continued, if he had continued to wage warfare against the French and to gain full independence from all of Indochina as well as Vietnam, instead of accepting the division, everything would have been better. Le Duan had been in charge of the Vietnamese South forces, and in 1959 it had come to power. It was Le Duan, along with those loyal compatriots shown on the slide, who made the key decisions about waging war in the South, and he was hell-bent on using every military means at his disposal to unify. It was Le Duan who ordered North Vietnamese regular troops to the south in 1963 along the Ho Chi Minh Trail that he had ordered constructed earlier. He ordered the Tet Offensive and the 1972 offensive and the 1975. The entire character and nature of the war followed his aggressive nature and belief that the only way to keep the initiative and defeat the Americans was through offensive use of regularly trained North Vietnamese troops. In general, American decision makers throughout the war did not know this and assumed the negotiated settlement with reasonable North Vietnamese leaders could lead to peace with a divided Vietnam. This slide depicts two quotes from the people mentioned on it. The first depicts the emphasis from Clausewitz on relationships and how they matter. An emphasis from General Colin Powell, a graduate of this institution and a student of Clausewitz, whom he mentioned frequently when he was Joint Chief of Staff during the First Gulf War. I've already alluded to the difficulties during the war in civil-military relations at the most senior levels. In fact, in August of 1967, General Wheeler and the Joint Chiefs discussed the possibility of resigning, only changing their minds because they felt they just could not do so during wartime. In turn, in 1972, President Nixon threatened to fire the entire JCS. In fact, during the entire Vietnam War, from JFK through Nixon, poor relations and dismal personal interreactions had a major, even decisive influence on the outcome of the war. Indeed, in my book, Warriors, I conclude that the relationship between American civilian and military leaders and advisors was fraught with misunderstandings, mistrust, and even disdain throughout the war. The resulting atmosphere, in turn, created a dysfunctional decision-making environment that ignored the enemy's capabilities and intent and failed to produce a coherent, agreed understanding of what actions were necessary to obtain the U.S. stated objectives of defending South Vietnam and preventing a communist takeover. To conclude, while my presentation here is about my service during the war and after, I would be remiss if I did not mention the service and sacrifice of my wife, Susan Flaherty Rothman, without whom that service would not have been possible. During the war, she traveled far and wide to give support to the widowed wives of several of my classmates. She successfully managed and executed 10 moves in her almost 30 years in the Army. Wow. God bless all of our spouses and families, and rest in peace, our fellow comrades in arms.